They mocked her fragile heart until it shut down their entire fleet. The starship Unity Dawn drifted through the void like a cathedral of war, its hull scarred by battles that had raged across 17 star systems. In the depths of space, where silence held dominion over the screams of the dying, this vessel represented humanity's first tentative step into a conflict that had already consumed civilizations older than human recorded history. The Galactic War had been raging for 3 centuries, before Earth even discovered faster-than-light travel, and now, in a desperate gambit born of political necessity, rather than strategic wisdom, the Coalition had agreed to accept human participants in their ancient struggle against the Krazh hegemony. Emma Carter sat in the observation deck, her small frame dwarfed by chairs designed for beings twice her size. The view beyond the reinforced transparisteel showed the aftermath of the Battle of Kepler's Edge debris fields that had once been proud warships now floating like metallic snow against the star-drunk darkness. Each piece of wreckage represented lives lost, strategies that had failed, hopes that had been crushed under the grinding wheels of inevitable war. She pressed her palm against the cool surface of the window, feeling the subtle vibration of the ship's massive engines as they pushed through space-time itself. Her reflection stared back, brown eyes that had seen too much dark hair pulled into a regulation knot that couldn't quite hide the tremor in her hands. The hands that had once held wounded soldiers as they died, that had written psychological profiles of enemy combatants, that had learned to recognize the exact moment when hope died in someone's eyes. The Unity Dawn was home to over 14,000 beings from a dozen different species, each one a specialist in some aspect of warfare that humans were only beginning to understand. The Drexel contributed their tactical precision, their ability to calculate firing solutions across impossible distances. The Veltar brought their mastery of defensive system shields that could turn aside the fury of dying stars. The synthetic consciousnesses of the Quen provided computational power that made human artificial intelligence look like clockwork toys. And then there was Emma, strategic psychologist, Class 7, assigned to Research Division, Tertiary. The title sounded impressive until you realized it meant she was essentially a note-taker with security clearance, someone whose job was to observe and document rather than participate in any meaningful way. The Coalition had accepted humans into their military structure not because they needed human capabilities, but because the political realities of the war demanded it. Earth's resources were valuable, but Earth's people were seen as little more than enthusiastic amateurs playing at a game whose rules they couldn't possibly understand. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had survived the fall of New Geneva by understanding human psychology under extreme stress, had helped develop the emotional support protocols that kept human soldiers functional in environments that drove other species to madness. But here, among beings who had evolved beyond such primitive concepts as fear and desperation, her expertise was viewed as quaint, at best, dangerous, at worst. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. Emma activated her personal display, watching as orders scrolled across the screen in the clinical language of military bureaucracy. She was being transferred to Deep Observation Post 7, a listening station on the edge of Krazh space, where psychological analysis was considered potentially useful for understanding enemy behavioral patterns. Another dead-end assignment. Another opportunity to watch from the sidelines while real warriors fought real battles. She had joined the Coalition forces hoping to make a difference, to prove that human understanding of emotion and motivation could be valuable in a war that seemed to have forgotten such concepts existed. Instead, she found herself relegated to the margins, her insights dismissed by beings who calculated probability matrices instead of reading body language, who processed emotional data as statistical anomalies rather than recognizing them as the fundamental drivers of all conscious behavior. But Emma had learned something during her years treating combat trauma, something that the Coalition's advanced artificial intelligences and quantum-enhanced strategists had overlooked in their pursuit of perfect logical solutions. She had learned that the most dangerous weapon in any conflict wasn't technology or tactics. It was the unpredictable moment when someone who had nothing left to lose decided to fight anyway. And as the Unity Dawn changed course toward the Outer Rim, carrying her toward another assignment where she would be ignored, dismissed, and forgotten, Emma Carter began to understand that she was about to become exactly that kind of person. Deep Observation. Post. 7 existed in the liminal space between civilization and chaos, a metal island anchored in the void, where the galaxy's edge dissolved into unexplored darkness. The station had been constructed 40 years ago as an early warning system, its sensors capable of detecting Krazh fleet movements across impossible distances. But early warning, as Emma learned within hours of her arrival, was a luxury the Coalition could no longer afford. The shuttle that delivered her to the station was a utilitarian transport designed for cargo rather than passengers, its acceleration couches retrofitted with human-compatible life support as an afterthought. As they approached the station's docking bay, Emma could see the accumulated battle damage that spoke of recent enemy incursions. Hull plates replaced with different alloy sensor arrays that had been hastily repaired rather than properly restored, the telltale scorch marks of energy weapons that had found their targets. Captain Dovnal was waiting in the docking bay when she disembarked, his forearms crossed in what she had learned was the Draxel equivalent of barely contained irritation. Standing nearly 3 meters tall with skin that shifted from deep blue to violet depending on his emotional state, he represented everything that Emma found simultaneously fascinating and frustrating about Coalition military culture. His species had evolved beyond the need for what they termed emotional volatility, replacing instinctive responses with calculated decision-making processes that approached mathematical perfection. Strategic psychologist Carter Oz, he said, his voice carrying the same tone one might use to acknowledge a minor equipment malfunction. "I've reviewed your assignment parameters. You will be working in Research Division Tertiary, analyzing behavioral data from enemy communications intercepts." Emma nodded, recognizing the dismissal inherent in the assignment. Behavioral data analysis was the kind of work typically assigned to junior technicians, busy work designed to keep non-essential personnel occupied while real strategists handled important decisions. "Thank you, Captain. I'm looking forward to contributing to the station's mission." Contribution. Dovnal's skin shifted toward a deeper violet, indicating what Emma's psychological training identified as skepticism edged with contempt. "Miss Carter, this is not one of your human military installations where emotional support and psychological counseling are considered valuable services. This is a combat station engaged in actual warfare against an enemy that has been perfecting the art of destruction for longer than your species has possessed written language." The words stung, but Emma had heard variations of the same dismissal from every Coalition officer she had encountered. Humans were tolerated because political necessity demanded it, but they were not respected because they brought nothing to the war effort that superior technology couldn't provide more efficiently. Their emotional responses were seen as weaknesses to be managed rather than strengths to be leveraged. "I understand, Captain," she replied, keeping her voice level, despite the urge to point out that human psychological insights had already proven valuable in several previous engagements. "I'll focus on my assigned duties and try not to interfere with station operations." Something in her tone must have registered with Dovnal because his skin shifted back toward blue as he studied her with all 4 eyes. "You have combat experience," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "New Geneva," Emma confirmed. "I was part of the trauma response team during the siege. 3 months of close quarters fighting while treating soldiers who—" She paused, recognizing that Dovnal wouldn't understand the psychological toll of watching young people break under stress that their minds weren't designed to handle. "I've seen what war does to people who aren't prepared for it. And you believe this experience qualifies you to understand interstellar warfare?" His tone carried the weight of 3 decades of military service against enemies that could erase solar systems from existence. Emma met his gaze steadily. "I believe it qualifies me to understand what happens when people are pushed beyond their breaking points, and I think you might be surprised by how relevant that becomes when you're fighting an enemy that has been doing exactly that to entire civilizations for centuries." For a moment, something flickered in Dovnal's expression. Not agreement, but perhaps a grudging recognition that her perspective might not be entirely worthless. Then his military professionalism reasserted itself, and he gestured toward the station's interior corridors. "Research Division Tertiary is located on Deck 7. You will report to IL-7, the station's analytical consciousness. It will provide you with your work assignments and explain the data classification protocols." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been warning. "Miss Carter, understand that emotional reactions are not just discouraged here, they are dangerous. This station operates on the edge of enemy territory, where a moment's hesitation or an irrational decision can result in the deaths of everyone aboard. I suggest you remember that. As Emma followed the direction indicators toward Deck 7, she reflected on the irony of Dovnal's warning. He saw emotional responses as dangerous variables that threatened operational efficiency, never realizing that those same responses might be the key to understanding an enemy that had consistently outmaneuvered every logical strategy the Coalition had deployed. Research Division Tertiary was exactly what she had expected, a cramped workspace filled with displays showing endless streams of intercepted communications, energy signatures, and behavioral analysis algorithms. The work was mind-numbing in its repetition: analyze enemy communication patterns, categorize tactical responses, identify statistical anomalies that might indicate strategic shifts. It was the kind of work designed to keep her busy, while ensuring she had no real influence on actual military operations. But Emma had learned patience during her years treating combat trauma, had developed the ability to find meaningful patterns in data that others dismissed as noise. And as she settled into her new assignment, watching displays full of Krazh fleet movements and communication intercepts, she began to notice something that the station's advanced analytical systems had missed. The enemy wasn't just winning through superior technology or tactical brilliance. They were winning because they understood something about their opponents that the Coalition's logical, emotionally neutral command structure couldn't recognize. Every species, no matter how advanced, had breaking points that could be identified and exploited through careful psychological manipulation. The Krazh weren't just fighting a war. They were conducting a massive psychological experiment, testing the limits of Coalition resolve with surgical precision. And the Coalition's reliance on logical decision-making was making them predictable in ways that their enemies had learned to exploit. Emma stared at the data streams, her mind working through implications that would have been dismissed as speculative psychology by every military AI on the station. But she could see the patterns forming, could recognize the careful orchestration of psychological pressure that the Krazh were applying to their enemies. For the first time since arriving at Deep Observation Post, 7 Emma Carter smiled, because she was beginning to understand that the Coalition's greatest weakness might also be their greatest opportunity if someone could find a way to make them listen. Il-7, known as Curio to the station's crew, was the closest thing Emma had to a colleague in Research Division Tertiary. The synthetic consciousness inhabited a semi-biological matrix that processed information in ways neither pure AI nor organic thought could achieve. Its physical form was an elegant combination of crystalline structures and flowing neural pathways, beautiful in the way mathematical equations could be beautiful when they described fundamental truths. Analyst Carter Saway. Curio said during her second week aboard, its voice carrying harmonics suggesting curiosity rather than clinical detachment. Your behavioral analysis reports contain interpretations that do not align with standard psychological assessment protocols. Emma looked up from the communication intercepts she'd been analyzing. Which interpretations specifically? You describe enemy tactical decisions as emotionally motivated, rather than strategically optimal. You categorize their communication patterns as intimidation displays, rather than information exchange protocols. Your analysis suggests Krazh military doctrine is designed to produce psychological effects, rather than tactical advantages. The synthetic consciousness paused its crystalline matrix, shifting through colors Emma had learned indicated deep processing. These interpretations are not consistent with established military intelligence methodologies. That's because established methodologies were developed by species that have evolved beyond emotional decision-making, Emma replied. You're trying to analyze an enemy that fights with emotion by using purely logical frameworks. It's like trying to understand music by measuring sound frequencies without acknowledging that the point is how it makes you feel. Let me show you something, Emma said, pulling up a tactical display showing the last 3 major engagements between Coalition and Krazh forces. Yeah, I'll look at the timing of enemy attacks. The Krazh don't just attack when they have tactical advantages. They attack when their opponents are most psychologically vulnerable. She highlighted data points corresponding to Coalition losses, overlaying them with psychological stress indicators she'd developed. The Battle of Proxima 7. The Krazh waited until Coalition forces had been on high alert for 6 weeks, then attacked when fatigue and stress had degraded decision-making capabilities. The Siege of New Carthage, they used hit-and-run tactics designed not to destroy Coalition vessels, but to create sustained anxiety that led to tactical errors. The conversation was interrupted by an alert from the station's primary sensor array. Captain Dovnal's voice echoed through the communication system with controlled urgency. All personnel to battle stations. Long-range sensors have detected Krazh scout ships approaching the outer perimeter. This is not a drill. Fury. Through the observation windows, Emma could see distant flashes marking incoming enemy vessels. The Krazh scouts moved with predatory grace, their ships designed with flowing curves suggesting organic growth rather than mechanical construction. They weren't attacking, not yet. They were studying the station's defensive responses with the same careful attention a psychologist might use to evaluate a patient's coping mechanisms. "They're not here to destroy us," Emma said, watching enemy movements with growing understanding. "They're here to learn how we respond to pressure. This is a psychological probe, not a military attack." Emma pulled up the tactical display showing enemy ships' approach vectors alongside coalition defensive deployments. "Look at their formation. They're staying just outside optimal weapons range, close enough to trigger our defensive responses, but far enough to avoid actual engagement. They're testing our reaction times, studying our tactical doctrines, measuring our stress responses under threat conditions." The enemy scouts continued their psychological ballet for 2 hours before withdrawing. Emma could see the toll the encounter had taken on the station's crew. Coalition personnel who had maintained perfect efficiency during the threat were now showing signs of post-adrenaline fatigue, their decision-making capabilities subtly degraded by prolonged alertness. "They're teaching us to be afraid," Emma explained to Curio. "Every time they probe our defenses like this, they're training our people to associate Krazh presence with stress and anxiety. Over time, that conditioning will degrade our combat effectiveness, even when we have tactical advantages." For the first time since Emma had arrived, Curio's response carried something approaching understanding rather than dismissal. "Your perspective suggests applications that fall outside standard military doctrine." Emma smiled, recognizing the synthetic consciousness's acknowledgement as the closest thing to validation she had received since joining coalition forces. Maybe it's time to consider that standard military doctrine isn't working against an enemy that fights with more than just weapons. The attack came 16 days later, emerging from hyperspace with violent precision. Emma was in Research Division Tertiary when the station's emergency klaxons began their urgent wail. Through the observation windows, she watched as space itself seemed to tear open, revealing the dark grace of Krazh battlecruisers materializing within the station's defensive perimeter. "All hands to battle, stations!" Captain Dovnal's voice carried controlled urgency. "Enemy forces have breached the outer perimeter. Estimate 14 hostile vessels of cruiser class or larger." Emma moved to the tactical display, pulling up real-time battle data. The Krazh fleet had appeared in perfect formation, their ships arranged with mathematical precision that spoke of careful planning rather than opportunistic aggression. But something about their positioning troubled her. They weren't deploying for optimal tactical advantage. Instead, they seemed arranged to maximize psychological impact, their formation designed to create the impression of overwhelming force rather than actual strategic superiority. The first exchange of fire lit up the darkness with violent beauty energy weapons, carving brilliant lines across the void as coalition defensive platforms engaged the attacking fleet. But even as the defensive batteries found their marks, Emma could see that something was wrong with the enemy's tactical response. The Krazh ships were taking damage they should have been able to avoid, allowing coalition weapons to score hits that competent tactical doctrine would have prevented. It was as if they were deliberately accepting casualties to achieve some objective beyond simple military conquest. "Captain Sci," Emma said, activating her communication link. "I need to speak with you about enemy tactical doctrine. They're not fighting to win, they're fighting to send a message." "Curio," she said, pulling up communication intercepts from the battle. "The Krazh are broadcasting on every frequency they can reach. They're not just attacking us. They're making sure that every coalition vessel in this sector knows exactly what's happening here." "Not if their primary objective isn't tactical victory," Emma replied, her understanding crystallizing as she watched the pattern of enemy attacks. "They're using this battle as a demonstration. Every coalition ship that receives these transmissions will see Deep Observation Post 7 being overwhelmed by superior Krazh forces. They're not just trying to destroy us, they're trying to demoralize every coalition commander who watches it happen." The battle continued for 3 hours, each minute stretching into an eternity of violence. When the enemy finally withdrew, they left behind carefully calculated devastation. 3 defensive platforms destroyed 17 coalition fighters, lost over 200 personnel casualties, enough destruction to demonstrate Krazh military superiority without completely eliminating the station's ability to report what had happened. Enemy casualty rate in this engagement was exactly 7%, Emma pointed out to Captain Dovnal. Their withdrawal wasn't strategic necessity. It was a planned conclusion to a performance designed for maximum psychological impact. Dovnal's skin shifted toward violet as he considered her analysis. You are suggesting that the Krazh deliberately limited their attack to achieve propaganda objectives rather than tactical ones. They're not just fighting battles, they're conducting psychological operations on a galactic scale, Emma replied. Every engagement is designed to reinforce coalition beliefs about Krazh invincibility, while gathering intelligence about our emotional and tactical responses. For the first time since Emma had arrived, Captain Dovnal studied her analysis with genuine interest rather than polite dismissal. Your assessment suggests that conventional tactical response protocols may be inadequate against this enemy. The conversation was interrupted by an incoming priority transmission from Coalition Command. Admiral Cartho Vel's image appeared, his expression carrying grave authority. Intelligence reports indicate that the engagement at Deep Observation Post 7 was observed by Krazh forces across 3 sectors. Enemy propaganda broadcasts are already utilizing combat footage to demonstrate coalition tactical inferiority. This engagement has been classified as a strategic defeat with sector-wide implications. Admiral, Emma said, stepping forward despite the breach of protocol. I believe I understand how the Krazh are achieving their tactical success. They're not just fighting our ships, they're fighting our confidence in our ability to win. And that's a battle we can learn to win if we're willing to fight it on their terms. Emma took a deep breath. The Krazh have learned to weaponize psychology itself. They're using our logical, emotionally neutral command structure against us by creating conditions where our rational decision-making processes become predictable enough to counter. But human psychology operates on different principles that might allow us to fight fire with fire. The opportunity came 3 weeks later, emerging from quantum static with urgent desperation. Coalition intelligence had detected a massive Krazh fleet movement toward the Talos system, where 17 billion civilians and the Coalition's primary shipbuilding facilities represented a target that could shift the entire balance of war. The enemy force was overwhelming over 300 vessels, ranging from fast attack craft to dreadnoughts that could crack planetary crusts. The situation is critical, Admiral Vel announced via secure transmission. Our defensive capabilities at Talos are insufficient to repel an assault of this magnitude. We are preparing to implement the Omega Protocol, complete evacuation of civilian populations, and strategic withdrawal of military assets. Emma studied the tactical display. Admiral, what's the timeline for the Krazh fleet arrival? Enemy forces will reach Talos in approximately 18 hours, Admiral Vel replied. Civilian evacuation will require a minimum of 36 hours to complete. The mathematics were brutal. Half the civilian population would still be planetside when the Krazh fleet arrived. Coalition forces would be forced to choose between sacrificing billions of lives or committing remaining military assets to a battle they couldn't win. There might be another option, Emma said. The Krazh aren't just attacking Talos for strategic value. They're doing it because they know we'll respond predictably. Either we sacrifice civilians to preserve military assets, or sacrifice military assets to protect civilians. Either choice reinforces their psychological narrative about coalition weakness. Emma moved to the tactical display, pulling up communication intercepts and psychological profiles she'd been analyzing. But psychological warfare cuts both ways. If we can identify and exploit their emotional vulnerabilities, we might be able to turn their own psychological weapons against them. I'm suggesting that they have psychological pressure points just like any other species, Emma replied. They've built their entire military doctrine around the assumption that coalition forces will respond logically to tactical threats. But what if we responded emotionally instead? Emma took a deep breath. We broadcast a direct challenge to the Krazh fleet commander. Not a tactical communication or diplomatic negotiations, a personal emotional challenge that targets their individual psychology rather than their military doctrine. You want to provoke an emotional response from an enemy fleet, Captain Dovnal said slowly, by challenging their personal honor rather than their tactical capabilities. She pulled up a communication interface composing a message that would either save 17 billion lives or condemn her to court-martial. "This is strategic psychologist Emma Carter of the Coalition Defense Force," she began. "I am transmitting this message to Fleet Commander Vashti Krell, whose tactical record indicates a preference for overwhelming force applied against defenseless targets." The words were carefully chosen, designed to strike at psychological vulnerabilities Emma had identified in captured Krazh personnel profiles. "Your fleet approaches Talos with overwhelming numerical superiority, confident in your ability to destroy civilians who cannot effectively resist your attack. This demonstrates tactical competence, but raises questions about individual courage. Would Fleet Commander Krell be willing to demonstrate personal combat effectiveness against an opponent capable of meaningful resistance?" Emma paused, understanding that the next words would determine whether her strategy succeeded or failed catastrophically. "I formally challenge Fleet Commander Krell to single combat with tactical command of Coalition forces as the prize. If you defeat me, Talos surrenders without resistance. If I defeat you, your fleet withdraws from this system immediately." The response came 18 minutes later, transmitted with arrogant confidence. "Human Emma Carter." The voice carried harmonics, suggesting amusement mixed with contempt. "Your challenge is accepted. Single combat will commence upon my fleet's arrival at Talos. Prepare yourself for defeat." Admiral Vell's image stared at Emma with expressions combining horror and fascination. "Analyst Carter, you have just committed Coalition forces to a tactical doctrine that has no precedent in recorded military history." Emma nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she'd done. Sometimes precedent is exactly what you need to abandon in order to survive. The Krazh have been defeating us because we keep fighting the war they expect us to fight. Maybe it's time to fight the war they're not prepared for. The hours between Emma's challenge and the Krazh fleet's arrival stretched like years, each minute weighted with implications of a decision that had committed Coalition forces to a strategy without precedent in galactic warfare history. Deep observation. Post 7 had become the focal point of urgent communications from Coalition Command, with senior officers demanding explanations for tactics that defied every principle of modern military doctrine. Emma found herself briefing Admiral Vell and the Coalition Supreme Council on psychological warfare principles that most had never considered legitimate military strategies. "Admiral, the Krazh have been using psychological warfare against us for decades," she explained. "They understand that military morale and command effectiveness are determined by factors that can't be measured by tactical computers. Individual leadership, personal courage, the willingness to take risks, that logical analysis would discourage these, determine whether fleets fight effectively or surrender without engaging." Captain Dovnall studied the psychological profiles Emma had compiled. "Your research indicates that Krazh military doctrine relies heavily on individual command authority, rather than collective decision-making processes." "Exactly," Emma replied. "Fleet Commander Krell isn't just the tactical leader of their forces, he's the psychological anchor that maintains their confidence in inevitable victory." Communication intercepts began arriving from throughout the Krazh fleet, revealing something unprecedented uncertainty. For the first time in recorded Coalition intelligence, Krazh commanders were expressing doubt about the outcome of an engagement. Krazh communication protocols have never included expressions of tactical uncertainty, reported Dr. Yinara Thess from Coalition Intelligence. "Their military doctrine assumes inevitable success based on superior preparation and overwhelming force application." Emma smiled, recognizing validation of theories she'd been developing. "They're not uncertain about their tactical capabilities. They're uncertain about something they've never had to consider before: the possibility that psychological warfare can be turned against them." The Krazh fleet arrived at Talos exactly 18 hours after Emma's challenge, but something was different about their formation. Instead of overwhelming psychological impact, their deployment seemed almost defensive, as if they were preparing for an attack rather than delivering one. "Enemy fleet has achieved orbit around Talos Prime," reported the tactical officer. "However, their formation suggests defensive positioning rather than assault preparation." The communication from Fleet Commander Krell arrived 37 minutes later. Human Emma Carter. The voice carried harmonics, suggesting confidence mixed with something that might have been respect. "You have issued challenge according to ancient customs that have not been invoked in 17 generations. Combat will be conducted according to traditional protocols, with tactical command as the agreed prize. The transport to Talos took 12 hours, giving Emma time to prepare for a confrontation that would be decided not by advanced technology or tactical brilliance, but by personal courage and psychological insight. When she arrived at the designated combat zone, a neutral space station constructed for resolving disputes between species with incompatible legal systems, Emma found herself face to face with an enemy she'd been studying but had never actually seen. Fleet Commander Vashti Krell was tall even by Krazh standards, his exoskeleton carrying scars of battles that had shaped both his tactical thinking and personal psychology. But what struck Emma most forcefully was something her psychological profiles had predicted, but she'd never truly believed until this moment he was just as nervous as she was. Human Emma Carter. Krell said, his voice carrying harmonics suggesting curiosity rather than contempt. Your challenge has achieved something unprecedented in Krazh military history. My fleet commanders are uncertain about the outcome of an engagement for the first time in their careers. Emma met his gaze steadily. Fleet Commander Krell, your psychological warfare strategies have been incredibly effective against coalition forces, but you made one critical mistake. You assumed that humans would always respond logically to psychological pressure. The combat chamber aboard the neutral station existed in a space between spaces, its walls constructed from materials that could contain energies that might otherwise tear holes in reality itself. Emma stood at one end, her hands empty of weapons, because the contest she was about to fight couldn't be won with technology or superior firepower. Across from her fleet commander, Krell waited with patient confidence of someone who had never lost a personal challenge in 4 decades of military service. But this wouldn't be physical confrontation. According to ancient protocols governing formal challenges between command-level officers, combat would be conducted through neural interface direct connection between their consciousness that would allow each combatant to attack the other's psychological foundations directly. It was warfare reduced to its most fundamental level, the battle between two minds for dominance. The interface will establish connection between your neural patterns, the station's AI explained. Combat continues until one participant achieves psychological dominance or withdraws from connection. Are both combatants prepared to proceed? Emma nodded, placing her hands on the neural interface controls. Years of treating combat trauma had given her something most coalition officers lacked the ability to enter other minds and understand the psychological damage that war inflicted on consciousness itself. She had learned to navigate the darkest corners of human psychology, to find light in minds broken by experiences too terrible for logic to process. I am prepared, Fleet Commander Krell announced. Human psychology is well documented in our tactical databases. This engagement will conclude quickly. The neural interface activated with a sensation like diving into deep water consciousness, leaving individual thought and expanding into shared space where minds could interact directly. Emma felt Krell's presence immediately, a vast, disciplined intelligence shaped by decades of military victory and absolute confidence in Krazh superiority. His first attack came like a stormfront psychological pressure designed to overwhelm her consciousness with images of coalition defeats and Krazh military superiority. She saw fleets burning planets scoured clean of life, the mathematical inevitability of human extinction played out across probability matrices that seemed to prove the futility of resistance. But Emma had seen similar images before, had helped human soldiers process trauma that should have broken their minds completely. She recognized Krell's attack not as an unstoppable force, but as a psychological strategy that relied on the target's acceptance of their own helplessness. Impressive, she said, her mental voice carrying calm assessment. You're using our own fears against us, amplifying doubts that already exist in coalition psychology. It's exactly the strategy I would expect from someone who has been studying human weakness for decades. Emma smiled, understanding that she was about to introduce Fleet Commander Krell to something that hadn't appeared in any of his tactical databases, human psychology under extreme stress, guided by someone who understood how to turn trauma into strength rather than allowing it to become weakness. Her counterattack began not with images of military victory, but with something far more personal: memories from her years treating combat trauma at New Geneva. She shared the experience of holding dying soldiers who refused to surrender despite hopeless odds of watching human beings discover courage they never knew they possessed when everything they cared about was threatened. "You've studied human psychology from the outside," Emma said, "but you've never understood what makes us dangerous when we have nothing left to lose." She opened her memories of the fall of New Geneva, not the tactical reports that Krazh intelligence had analyzed, but the personal experience of watching a city die while its defenders chose to fight rather than surrender. Krell experienced it through her consciousness, the terror and desperation and overwhelming grief that should have broken human resistance, but which instead had been transformed into something Krazh's psychological analysis couldn't quantify: the stubborn refusal to accept defeat, even when logic demanded surrender. Krell's psychological assault faltered as he encountered mental patterns that defied his understanding of how consciousness should respond to overwhelming pressure. Through Emma's memories, he experienced emotions as they actually functioned in human psychology, not as weaknesses, but as sources of strength that enabled impossible victories. "This is impossible," Krell's mental voice carried confusion. "Psychological trauma should degrade tactical effectiveness, not enhance it." Emma pressed her advantage, sharing memories that revealed the fundamental truth: Krazh's psychological warfare had missed human beings at their breaking point, didn't break the way other species did. Instead, they discovered reserves of strength that existed beyond the reach of logical analysis. "You've been fighting coalition forces," Emma said, her mental voice carrying certainty she'd spent years learning to project. "But you've never fought human beings who understand that psychological warfare can be turned against its users." The neural interface began to resonate with harmonics. The station's AI had never recorded consciousness patterns, suggesting psychological contact beyond normal parameters of mental combat. Emma felt Krell's confidence fragmenting as he encountered something Krazh's tactical doctrine had never prepared him for: an opponent who could not only resist psychological pressure, but could redirect it with surgical precision against its source. "Your psychological warfare strategies are effective against species that respond logically to emotional pressure," Emma said, "but humans don't respond logically to anything when the people we care about are threatened." Fleet Commander Krell's consciousness convulsed as decades of tactical certainty encountered evidence that contradicted everything he believed about psychological warfare. In that moment of ultimate vulnerability, Emma struck with precision that came from years of understanding exactly how consciousness responded to carefully applied pressure. "Yield," she said, her mental voice carrying the same tone she had used with soldiers whose minds had been broken by trauma too severe for normal healing. "You've learned something that your tactical databases never included. Human psychology becomes most dangerous when it has nothing left to lose." The neural interface disconnected with a sensation like surfacing from impossible depths. Fleet Commander Krell stood motionless for several moments, his exoskeleton reflecting colors that suggested psychological states Emma couldn't identify. "The challenge is concluded," the station's AI announced. "Fleet Commander Krell has withdrawn from neural combat. According to established protocols, tactical command transfers to the victorious participant." Emma felt the weight of absolute victory settling on her shoulders, not just personal triumph, but strategic success that would reshape the entire balance of galactic warfare. Through sheer psychological pressure applied with surgical precision, she had achieved something that superior firepower and tactical brilliance had failed to accomplish. The withdrawal of the Krazh fleet from Talos began within hours of Emma's victory, their vessels departing with mechanical precision that couldn't quite conceal the unprecedented nature of their retreat. For the first time in over 3 centuries of galactic warfare, Krazh forces were abandoning a strategic objective not because of tactical defeat, but because their command structure had been psychologically compromised by an opponent they had never learned to counter. Emma returned Deep Observation Post 7 aboard a Coalition transport whose crew treated her with the careful respect normally reserved for unstable explosive devices. She had become something unprecedented in galactic military history, a human officer whose tactical capabilities were not only acknowledged, but actually feared by Coalition command staff who couldn't understand how psychological warfare could be more effective than superior firepower. Analyst Carter, Admiral Vell, said during the post-engagement briefing, his image carrying expressions that combined recognition with something approaching wariness, "Your psychological warfare demonstration has achieved tactical results that our strategic AI systems classified as impossible. Fleet Commander Krell's surrender has created cascade effects throughout Krazh command structure that intelligence is still attempting to analyze. Emma sat in the command center of Deep Observation Post 7, surrounded by beings whose enhanced intelligence had been designed to process information beyond human comprehension, but who were now struggling to understand concepts that couldn't be reduced to logical analysis. Admiral, what we learned at Talos is that the Krazh have been defeating us by making us fight on their terms. They understand psychological warfare, but they've never encountered opponents who could fight back using the same methods. Captain Dovnal's skin had settled into shades of blue that Emma had learned indicated genuine curiosity rather than skeptical assessment. Your tactical approach suggests that human psychological capabilities represent strategic assets that have been underutilized in coalition military doctrine. More than that, Emma replied, pulling up displays that showed communication intercepts from throughout Krazh space. The news of Fleet Commander Krell's defeat is spreading through enemy command networks faster than tactical intelligence normally travels. They're not just dealing with a military setback, they're dealing with the psychological impact of discovering that their enemies can fight back, using weapons they thought only they possessed. Curio's crystalline matrix pulsed with processing patterns that Emma had never seen before, new harmonics that suggested the synthetic consciousness was struggling to incorporate concepts that didn't exist in its original programming. Analysis of enemy communications indicates unprecedented patterns of tactical uncertainty and strategic reevaluation. Krazh forces are reassessing threat levels and modifying operational procedures in ways that suggest fundamental changes to their military doctrine. The reports that followed confirmed Emma's analysis in ways that exceeded even her most optimistic projections. Across 17 sectors, Krazh forces were demonstrating tactical hesitation that hadn't existed in their military behavior for over 2 centuries. Enemy commanders who had previously attacked with absolute confidence were now requesting additional intelligence and strategic assessment before engaging coalition forces. They're afraid, Emma explained to the assembled coalition command staff, not afraid of our weapons or our tactical capabilities, but afraid that they might encounter more opponents like me, humans who understand psychological warfare well enough to turn it against them. The strategic implications were staggering. The galactic war that had raged for centuries was fundamentally changing, not because of new technologies or superior tactics, but because one species had finally learned to fight back, using methods that their enemies had assumed were uniquely their own. Intelligence reports indicate that Krazh forces are implementing new protocols for engaging human personnel, Admiral Vell announced during one of the regular briefings. They appear to be treating individual humans as high-priority psychological threats rather than minor tactical concerns. Emma smiled, understanding that her victory at Talos had achieved something that years of conventional warfare had failed to accomplish. Admiral, we've spent decades trying to match Krazh technological superiority and tactical precision, but we've been fighting the wrong war. Human psychology isn't a weakness that needs to be eliminated from military doctrine. It's a strategic advantage that we've been too afraid to use. The months that followed saw the development of what became known as the Carter Protocol's psychological warfare techniques that were built specifically around human emotional capabilities, rather than attempting to eliminate them from military operations. Coalition forces began integrating human psychological specialists into command structures not as support personnel, but as tactical officers whose expertise in emotional manipulation was recognized as a legitimate military capability. But perhaps more importantly, the Galactic War itself began to change. Krazh forces faced with opponents who could match their psychological warfare capabilities started engaging in actual negotiations rather than simply demanding surrender. The psychological dominance that had enabled their military expansion for centuries had been broken by the demonstration that their enemies possessed the same weapons and could use them with equal effectiveness. 6 months after the Battle of Talos, Emma found herself standing in the council chambers of Coalition headquarters, addressing an assembly of military leaders from across the galaxy. The room was filled with beings whose intelligence had been enhanced by technology that allowed them to process information at superhuman speeds, but who were now learning that some forms of knowledge couldn't be downloaded or calculated. "The Krazh have agreed to peace negotiations," She announced, her voice carrying across the chamber with the authority of someone who had achieved the impossible through methods that most military doctrine had dismissed as primitive superstition. Not because they lack the military capability to continue fighting, but because they've learned that psychological warfare is no longer a uniquely Krazh advantage. The silence that followed was broken by Admiral Vell's voice carrying tones that Emma had never heard before in Coalition military communications: genuine respect, mixed with something that approached gratitude. "Strategic psychologist Carter," he said, using her full title for the first time since she had joined Coalition forces. "Your tactical innovations have not only achieved unprecedented strategic success, but have fundamentally altered the balance of galactic warfare. The Coalition formally recognizes psychological warfare as a legitimate military discipline with human psychological specialists, granted full command authority in relevant tactical situations." Emma stood before the assembled Coalition leadership, understanding that she had achieved something far more significant than personal recognition. Human psychology, which had been dismissed as an evolutionary weakness unsuited for modern warfare, was now acknowledged as a strategic capability that could determine the outcome of interstellar conflicts. 1 year later, the Galactic War ended, not with overwhelming military victory or negotiated surrender, but with something unprecedented in the history of interstellar conflict: genuine peace between species that had learned to fight using psychological methods rather than simply trying to destroy each other through superior firepower. The memorial erected at Talos carried an inscription in over 40 different languages, but the message was simple enough for any species to understand: in memory of those who proved that the strongest weapons are not always the ones that destroy, but sometimes the ones that heal. Emma Carter returned to her work as a strategic psychologist, but now her insights were sought by military commanders throughout Coalition space who had learned that understanding consciousness was just as important as understanding technology. The SciFi stories that circulated through the lower decks spoke of her victory, not as tactical brilliance, but as proof that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they learned to transform their supposed weaknesses into unexpected strengths. And in the quiet corners of Deep Observation Post 7, where new psychological warfare specialists now trained under her guidance, Emma taught the most important lesson she had learned during her journey from dismissed analyst to strategic victor. The human heart isn't a weakness to be eliminated from military doctrine. It's the weapon that no enemy can truly understand until it's too late to defend against it. The galaxy had learned that in a universe where everything could be measured, calculated, and optimized, the one force that remained truly unpredictable was the human capacity to find strength in vulnerability, to discover courage in fear, and to achieve victory through methods that logic alone could never comprehend. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that your emotions aren't weaknesses, but potential strengths waiting to be understood, then take a moment to reflect on the battles you're fighting in your own life. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that being underestimated can become the greatest advantage of all. Because in a universe that often overlooks the power of the human heart, we all need reminders that our deepest feelings might be our most powerful weapons. Like and subscribe for more sci-fi stories that explore what it means to be human in an infinite cosmos that's still learning to understand us.